We have another special interview show here for you. Speaking of interviewing, I have as my guest the man who's considered by many to be among the best, if not the best, some have said, interviewer there is. His career goes way beyond interviewing, however. He's a comedian, TV sports anchor, and actor as well. He's also won many Emmy and Cable Ace Awards. I'd like to introduce to you Roy Firestone. Now, Roy, if you could start by talking about where you grew up and what got you into entertainment and television.
Well, I'm originally from Miami, Florida, and the interesting thing is, from the very beginning, I've always been around and fascinated by the microphone. I've been a fan of radio for most of my life, particularly radio play-by-play. I've been a guy that has enjoyed listening to broadcasts for much of my life, and when I was 15, I had a chance to be a bat boy for the Baltimore Oriole baseball team.
Cool.
And I did get that job, and for 2 years I was around the greatest athletes in the world, everybody from Hank Aaron to Brooks Robinson to Frank Robinson to Roberto Clemente, and on it went. And so once I got a taste of that, I decided to get into a taste for broadcasting, and the two sort of merged, and I was lucky enough to get a job in my hometown of Miami, Florida, where I was there, and from 1975 to about 77, I was in Miami, and then from 77 on, I've been in Los Angeles.
Miami's such a great city. I've visited there a couple times, stayed in Miami Beach, right there, Sunny Isles, what is it, 163rd and Collins.
Very good, very
Love
true.
it.
Yeah.
Miami Beach is terrific, and it's a great area down there. Now, during the 1970s, as you mentioned, you left Miami, you came to Los Angeles, you worked at KCBS TV. Talk about working at Channel 2.
Well, Channel 2 was fantastic for me. My first major market television appearance, presentation for me to do the kinds of things that I like to do, write, and produce, and to interview, and it really gave me an introduction to what then was the USA Network. They saw me, they liked me. I went on the USA Network with a show called Sports Look. I went from Sports Look to Up Close in 1984. But you know, USA was where it all started for me as a national talk show host, but Channel 2 was where I had a chance to work with people like Brent Musburger and Connie Chung, and people like that, Maury Povich later. There were so many great experiences there, and I really cut my teeth in journalism locally at KCBS, and back then it was called KNXT. So I'm dating myself a little bit, but I go back there, oh gosh, it'll be 23 years now since I've been there, yeah.
How about that? Now, at one time, as I recall, weren't you like a Laker pregame host?
I was the Laker pregame host at KHJ, which later became KCAL, and we did a lot of the championship years. We interviewed everybody from Pat Riley to Magic to Chick Hearn. They were all on our show. We had a real special time. Those were back in the days when you had, 8 or 9 channels as opposed to 800 or 900 channels.
Big difference.
Yeah, but those were great years, and we were very fortunate to be around the broadcasts of the greatest Laker team, in my mind, ever assembled. That was with Magic and Kareem and Worthy and Byron Scott and Michael Cooper. So we had a wonderful time there and there.
Now, we're going to talk a lot about sports and your fantastic interviews here. Now, you've done so many great ones down through the years, but your career goes beyond sports reporting. Mm-hmm. You're also a comedian, an actor, impressionist, and more, and you performed all around the country. Take as much time as you need. Talk about your stand-up and comedy.
Well, that really grew from the very beginning, to be honest with you, Bob. To be honest with you, I started as a kind of child stand-up, if you want to call it that. Grew up in Miami, Florida, and Miami Beach was sort of the elderly Borscht Belt even then, back then. But I would perform for some like elderly groups and perform for some community service groups, and I'd do a little show here, about 5 or 10 minutes of material. But that evolved into my singing, which I've been doing now for 17, 18 years. I've got an album coming out with a band called Hiroshima, which was a big fusion band. I'm going to be producing a full-fledged album on that. I sing big band music. I sing pop and jazz. But I was back then started out as a comedian, but I did musical stuff, and I do kind of a range of impressions and vocal bits, and that's grown now. I do that around the country. I perform all over the country. I have my own website, royfirestone.com, where people can really see what I do. And it's been an unbelievable experience for me. I've shared the stage with people like Frank Sinatra and Gladys Knight, and I've performed with the Four Tops and Lou Rawls and Dionne Warwick and other people like that. Most recently, Michael McDonald and the Doobie Brothers. It was a great experience and continues to be so.
And you also do great singing impressions. You mentioned Frank Sinatra. I've seen you do that. And then I saw you on a talk show sometime back. You did impressions of not one Bee Gee, but all three Bee Gees. You kind of grew up near the Bee Gees in Miami, didn't you?
Yeah. Well, in fact, the irony is they lived about a block away from me growing up. And I did all three Bee Gees at once. Was kind of a fun thing. Right.
I can't do it as well as you can, but
well, I've always enjoyed doing impressions like the Bee Gees and like Sinatra and like Tony Bennett, and I like the old school impressions as much as I like the new stuff. But I do a little of everything in my show. Smokey Robinson, and we do Billy Joel and things like Beatles and stuff like that. The Doors. I have a lot of fun with a variety of things that I do.
Great, great. Now, in the 1980s, you began hosting an interview show that ran on ESPN called Sports Look. How did this show come about?
Well, Sports Look started, as I said, at USA Network first, back in 1980. It was originally a co-host situation. It evolved into a solo interview show, and I was from there in 1984. Sports Look became Up Close. And Up Close ran from 84 until basically 94, and then I did several more years as the host of Up Close Primetime. So I was on, a long time, 22 years in interviewing nonstop, and so I've had a real good run at doing that.
Why the change from Sports Look to Up Close?
Well, USA had Sports Look first, and Up Close became an ESPN run show and a managed show. Mazda had the Mazda car company owned the old Sports Look show, and then when they moved on, ESPN decided they're going to manage the Sports Look show and turn it into their own show. So we called it Up Close and changed the whole format, and really that's how it evolved.
Okay. Now, over the years, you've had many, many great guests while you were host of Up Close. A couple I wanted to talk about up front first here.
Sure.
One is Howard Cosell.
Howard Cosell, absolutely. Well, Howard was he didn't so much do an interview as he lectured you. And I had a chance to do that, and I loved having him on. I was for about a year and a half one of his favorite people, then I became not such a favorite person.
Oh.
But it's okay because he was really quite an interesting character to be around, and I got to know him, and he was still one of my first heroes in the industry, and I really admire to this day the fact that he said things that no one else has ever really said.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you hear it on talk radio now, but he was very courageous in a time when it was not popular to be courageous, and I always have great reverence and respect for Cosell, and I got to meet him, became associated with Howard. For a lot of people in the movie Ali wanted me to play Howard Cosell, but I think they had John Voight, who was a little more of a seasoned actor.
Oh, okay. Well, that's cool. Yeah, he was. Howard Cosell died, I believe it was in 1995, and I remember, in fact, it may have even been on your show or somebody else's show. Harry Carey went up to Howard Cosell and said, Howard, I've been doing regionally what you've been doing long before what you were doing nationally. So that's what. Now, another person that you interviewed, a sports interview that you did, was former President Richard Nixon.
That's not a bad impression.
How
either,
did that
Bob.
go?
Not bad, not bad. I interviewed Nixon in the early 90s when he was going over his baseball all-star selections, all-time team, and he was gracious enough to do an hour interview with me. And the thing about it is, to put it mildly, I was not a huge Nixon fan as a kid, but there was something about sports that gives you an opportunity to get to know people and their character and what their likes and their soul is about. And I really enjoyed being around him for the hour because it cut past politics and philosophies of how you govern, and became about two baseball fans talking baseball, which I really enjoyed.
That's really cool. Talk about interviewing Michael Jordan.
Michael was a very young man when he came on our show. I think one year he was still in North Carolina, and then we had him a couple more times. Very shy at first, not the most revealing guy at first. He became an icon, things became more a public record, and he became more aware. But, Michael was a guy who had an ability to charm people just based on what he did on the court. Off the court, he was much more shy, withdrawn, and more private. But Michael was a great guest, and I still consider one of my favorite guests.
Sure. Now, I know another of your favorite guests to interview, Will Chamberlain.
Well, it was great. The first time I interviewed Will Chamberlain, well, before I had him on, I had him on the show in the early 80s, but to get him on the show, I ran into him at a restaurant, and he was in a $300,000 white Rolls Royce. So Wilt was dressed in a silver and purple jumpsuit with a lemon line beret and a red fez feather coming out the back, and he was 7'2", 350 pounds. And I said, Wilt, I'd love to do the show. And at first he said, well, I'd like to do the show, but right now I'm trying to keep a low profile. So that shows you what kind of profile he had.
Yeah, there you go. I know another one who was interesting on your show is Don King.
Yeah, Don was, I don't know if he was the picture of boxing, but he was He was, I always compared him to the Joker in Batman. I always thought he would have been the ultimate Joker for Batman as an arch villain. He had the hair, he had the laugh. He was really typecast, but Don was boxing. He and Aram were boxing in the 70s and 80s. What he said went. And he had everybody from Muhammad Ali to Larry Holmes to Mike Tyson, and everyone ended up despising him, I suppose, or suing him. But he was a real character, and I think that you don't see people like Don King much anymore. It's too corporate now.
Right, exactly. What were some other memorable interviews that you did?
Well, I mean, I've had the great pleasure of interviewing everybody from Andre Agassi to Miles Davis, to from Ansel Adams, the great landscape photographer, to Jimmy Stewart, the actor, to Madonna, to people like that. I've had, generations of football players. I've had juniors, seniors on it together. I've had Griffies. I've had, everybody from Nolan Ryan on to, people of that caliber. Barry Bonds when he was 175 pounds, and Barry Bonds when he was 250 pounds.
There you go.
So I've had, at 5,000 interviews, it's really hard to pick one. Barkley is one of my favorites, clearly. People like Olajuwon with Barkley was a great show. We had the opportunity to talk to, people like Shaq, people like Tommy Lasorda. All of these people were very, very personal. But I would say probably the most engaging and intelligent, thoughtful, funny, entertaining person in general was Jim Valvano. He was probably my all-time favorite all-around guest.
How about that? That is great. Now, which one was the most emotional?
Well, we've had a lot of them.
I know Mercury Morris was one.
Mercury Morris definitely was. Dennis Rodman was one. I had about, people always say, in fact, the name of our book is Don't Make Me Cry, Roy.
Right.
People always say, well, he makes them cry. But the truth is, I've had probably 25 guests of the 5,000 cry. That's a fraction of a fraction of a fraction. But the one interesting thing is that people remember that. And they remember people like Bill Walton having tears on my show, which is available. You can see that on YouTube. Or Hubie Brown, or Trent Dilfer. People like that talking about their lives. And the emotion, I think, that bubbles from the top is a really great quality, because it really shows people that these are human beings. And
Sure.
I think at the end of the day, people are looking for that. They're looking for some kind of sign that hey, he's just like me.
There you go. Now, was there ever a time when a guest was so upset they almost walked off the set?
Oh yes. Barry Switzer, I should say. Barry Sanders, the opposite. He was the sweetest guy. Switzer was very upset. Ted Turner actually did walk off the show once. Kevin Johnson, the fine guard of Phoenix Suns, he walked off the show because he was really late for practice once. But that was in the middle of an interview, which is kind of weird. I've had a couple of people threaten.
Oh, no. What happened with Barry Switzer?
He didn't like the line of questioning, and he threatened to walk off, and more or less wanted to walk off the show, but felt like he might as well hang in there till the end. But he wasn't pleased. We're actually good friends now, but at the time it was very tense.
There were several times, and you talked about this a little bit earlier, you would have two guests on at the same time. One example of this that was unique was when you had coaches Tom Osborne and Bobby Bowden on a few days after they coached in the national title game in January 1994, won by Florida State in a tight game, 18-16 over Nebraska. Osborne, Nebraska, Bowden for Florida State. How did that come about?
Well, they had been booked for several weeks, and the idea was whoever won the game was going to be the coach to come on. But the other coach felt, I think it was obviously in this case Osborne, that he didn't want to leave Coach Bowden out of it. So it was very nice that they both came on. So they talked about the game and what the national championship means, and I thought it was a pretty good show. And I think they learned a little bit more about each other that they didn't know before. So it was a rare kind of situation.
And it was a great show too. Also a unique combination you had on. This was in the early 1990s when you had Father Jack and son Joe, St. Louis baseball broadcasters Jack Buck and Joe Buck.
That was really something. In fact, to this day, Joe remembers that show. Joe Buck, of course, people know now as the voice of Fox Sports. But Jack Buck was an incredible broadcaster, one of the most venerable broadcasters in the history of baseball, and really a lot of other sports, too. He did everything. Funny, witty, smart, classic broadcaster, and Joe following in his steps. But at the time, Joe Buck hadn't really been a major play-by-play announcer. He was just cutting his teeth in the broadcasting.
He was about 23 at the time.
Yes, it was really an amazing experience, and we went out for lunch afterwards and talked about it. It was one of my favorite programs. I loved Jack Buck personally. I thought he was a terrific human being, war hero, interesting stories and anecdotes and takes on life. And Joe really is a great embodiment of what Jack represents.
Continuing on talking about your ESPN interview show Up Close, Kurt Smith, baseball historian, was on your show.
Yep.
And he released a book that listed the top baseball announcers of all time. Number 5, Red Barber. Number 4, Jack Buck. We just talked about him. Number 3, Ernie Harwell. Number 2, Mel Allen. Number 1, Vin Scully. Your thoughts on this list?
Well, I don't think I could quibble too much with any of those guys. I might possibly throw in the great Chuck Thompson as one of the announcers. I would put him in there. Bob Costas is a great announcer, although he was not a standard play-by-play man on a general basis. But I certainly think that Vin Scully's the greatest announcer in baseball history. I definitely believe that he is the, people call him the poet laureate of baseball. But I always felt that Vin had carried something. He had a dignity. He had a storytelling style and an ability to put into words almost a kind of eloquence that was missing in other areas. He's the best announcer I've ever been around. It's been a pleasure, and continues to be so, to listen to him even now, well into his 70s, and I hope that he keeps going to doing it as long as he wants, because I think that he's still the finest announcer we've ever heard in this profession.
Larry Stewart, longtime Los Angeles Times media writer, called Vin Scully the best play-by-play man in the history of the United States, and he may be correct. You had Vin on your show several times.
Yes. In fact, the interesting thing is Vin does not sit down for long-form interviews too much, and I was very flattered to know that he would come on my show to do sort of the quintessential interview of him about his life, and he gave us 2 full shows, 2 full half hours, and I to this day regard that as one of my favorite 2 shows. I would love to have those copies of those shows, but Vin Scully talking about everything from the early Dodgers, Jackie Robinson, to Kirk Gibson, and everything in between was one of my favorite experiences. And one of my, of course, most memorable moments with that interview is we talked about Roy Campanella and, of course, the famous game where everyone lit a candle at the Coliseum, and Roy Campanella, of course, was paralyzed in an automobile accident in the off-season, and it was an emotional, moving event, and Scully was sort of one of the people who helped lead the people into lighting those candles, and at least giving them the cue to do it, and it was a very moving experience. And he also said a lot of things that were very wise, and you don't really find that kind of wisdom much anymore.
Well, I certainly appreciate you thinking that highly of me, Roy. It was great to be on your show. It's time for Dodger Baseball. Now, in 1995, you left Up Close. Why?
Well, I had run almost, at that point, pretty close to 3,000 shows at that point. I've done 5,000 now. And I wanted something new. I wanted something that was fresh. And so I had a chance to do specials. And on each special, I could do a half-hour interview or 20-minute interview with 3 people in one show. So, for example, in one show, I was just watching a show the other night. We had Ted Williams. Wow. We had David Robinson, who was the reigning MVP. We had Dennis Rodman. And Cal Ripken, all on one show.
Okay.
And that would take me a month to get those kind of guests, and we had them all in one show. So that was fun. And it turned into sort of the Barbara Walters special. I enjoyed doing that immensely.
And that wraps up my discussion with longtime interviewer Roy Firestone. Thank you for listening.